Hi, welcome to Responding to Disinformation and Influence Campaigns, session AIR T08 RSA for 2021. We're very excited to be here. I'm Todd Inskeep. I'm a longtime information security professional and longtime panel leader and speaker here at RSA. Been working in information security for well over 25 years. With me today, I've got three panelists I'm very excited to be talking to. Mark Aista is the managing director at Duke Energy and a former FBI agent with a long history in information security and protecting systems. Melissa O'Leary is here from Fortalice Solutions. Melissa's been working as the chief strategy officer and working with several of the clients at Fortalice on these problems of misinformation and disinformation. Finally, I've got J.D. Work, a former intelligence officer, giving us a different perspective from his experience and his position at the Marine Corps University. Thank you guys for being here. I'm very excited to get started talking about this. So as we think about this idea of talking about responding to disinformation, understanding and thinking about misinformation campaigns, one of the things that I think is really tough for people to understand is that these campaigns really do affect individual companies and attack individual products. So one of the first things I think about in this is, how do you identify these kinds of campaigns? Melissa, why don't we start with you? Can you tell us a little bit about what you see?
Sure. Unfortunately, in our practice, I think that folks identify it when it's too late. So there's certainly a very large human element and a human reaction to campaigns. To give you a case study, we worked with a high-profile lawyer who was targeted by a former employee who essentially created a false narrative about the lawyer's background. And it was actually very easy to do, in that he found essentially another individual with the same name that had a sordid history and was able to align that with the high-profile lawyer, publishing things on a blog, and then top-level searches were kind of right out there disparaging the high-level lawyer. So we had to go through a takedown process and quite a bit of work to assist this person. And as you mentioned, there was a high emotional toll. A high-profile lawyer working on many important cases, completely preoccupied with this misinformation campaign that was going on around him. So it totally misdirected his work and his life for a period of time. And unfortunately, the way it was identified was, through just searching for himself.
Yeah. Mark, how does this impact in the energy sector, where there's always a lot of discussion about different topics in energy? What happens in your world?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Todd. We have to respond to disinformation. We have to respond to information that comes in or intelligence that comes in, and we have a responsibility to vet it. Is this legitimate or is it not? But even in the case of misinformation where something may not be accurate, it could still be perceived as a threat. My role is to maintain our assets, protect our customers, our employees, and our ability to power our communities. And so when there's a disinformation campaign that is engaged, we have an obligation to find out the facts quickly and then respond to it.
Yeah. And how do you do that? How do you kind of go about looking for misinformation campaigns in your sector?
Sure. So it starts with a robust intelligence program, both a physical security or a physical intelligence and a cybersecurity intelligence program, vetting out what is accurate, what isn't. We've got a number of vendors and tools that we use that helps us determine the veracity of the intelligence. And then based on that, we have to respond.
Yeah. And Mark or JD, how does this influence kind of organizations and sectors? So when you think about where you're working from in kind of a broader intelligence community and broader community perspective, how should organizations be thinking about identifying this kind of activity, and what should they be doing about it?
So when we think about the problem of malign influence by hostile foreign intelligence services, and I'll confine my remarks to overseas problems, there are a number of domestic issues, but that's simply outside of my remit. It does help to understand how these foreign intelligence services approach the mission, because it really is a mission for those players and the contractor ecosystem that supports their operations in the information environment. Russian intelligence doctrine in particular is very important for us to unpack when we're looking at both how those services are engaged in it and how other services that are copying their successes are going about this. Their doctrine does not split cyber from influence operations. They consider both within the overarching concept of information confrontation. Now, how do we know this? Well, the Russian intelligence services have been kind enough to talk about this for many years. They watched the development of our Western doctrine for information warfare throughout the early period of the 1990s and pursued their own version of those ideas. It coincided with a very rare period of openness where much of their strategic literature was becoming available for the first time outside of Soviet-era classification restrictions. Previously, to obtain copies of these journals and other papers in which these ideas were talked about, the West had to leverage human intelligence assets penetrating Soviet intelligence. We know from declassified histories that such documents were among the many valuable things provided to Western intelligence services by several key assets in the Cold War period, some of whom died, bringing us that insight. Things got a lot easier in the post-Soviet era. Unfortunately, it's become much more complicated with the return of great power competition. When you look at these writings, you see that they're explicitly seeking to disorganize a series of targets, including traditional government and military elements, but also transnational entities, including corporations, international and non-governmental organizations, and networked activists. They're pursuing these for a variety of strategic objectives, and the operations themselves may have little to do with the targets that they're leveraging in seeking these objectives. These victims are rather merely instrumental to some perceived advantage that these services carry out. So it's really about understanding the foreign government objective involved, what they think they can gain, what they think they can disorganize within our Western targets, and how they're going about it.
I want to dig into that just a little bit. How does that unpack in two ways? First, how does it unpack for other foreign governments? So you mentioned the Russians actually do consider targeting transnational organizations, so large global companies headquartered in the US and elsewhere. Do other countries target in the same way? If I think about the Iranians, the Iraqis, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, is it kind of a global problem? And when you think about national intelligence organizations kind of attacking companies?
Very much. It is a global problem. We've seen multiple other actors that have been watching the cycle of operational experimentation by the Russian services, particularly through these new online and social media mediated campaigns. And they're learning from the lessons the Russians have demonstrated in practice, both through hack and leak operations, as well as through large scale coordinated and authentic persona development. What we considered core Russian doctrine is actually being copied in practice, and indeed perhaps with some degree of the same strategic thinking in new campaigns. We've seen this in a variety of less mature actors. The recent Office Director of National Intelligence reporting called out declassified reporting called out the Venezuelan campaigns. We've seen extensive industry reporting around Iranian campaigns. Of particular interest is a campaign that was dubbed by industry Endless Mayfly. It mattered to me personally because in July 2020, as a fire that destroyed a U.S. amphibious warship at port in San Diego was still smoldering, this campaign was actually circulating forged documents impersonating a prominent U.S. lawmaker to advance, frankly, racist and abhorrent themes. This messaging and the persona associated with this messaging, this forged document, have actually been attributed to this Iranian-linked campaign. It was not terribly effective. It was rapidly countered and the persona is taken down by Twitter. But we've seen quite serious developments in that from that service. We've also seen Endless Mayfly promote messaging attempting to stoke racial divisions around the COVID vaccination research and the rollout of candidate injections in the US in mid-2020, clearly seeking to discredit the vaccination process in the minds of the general public.
Yeah. So the other way I want to unpack it, and I'm going to ask Melissa to comment on this, is this is nation state against corporation. And certainly there are some big corporations with big budgets, but is it reasonable for an individual company to be thinking about how to identify and counter national resources, national level attacks around misinformation and things that a national level attack might be doing?
Yeah, Todd, it's an interesting question. And in my opinion, there is a certain responsibility that companies and individuals and others hold to protect themselves. I wish that didn't exist. However, when you're going up against a nation state, you're not going to be able to defend yourself with just the assistance of one party. It takes really the public-private partnership to assist companies and the government and our democracy in moving ahead in this area and being able to counter the threat. Companies as end users certainly should have more robust intelligence centers. Mark mentioned that, as part of his work, he has that in place. Many of the companies that we work with do not have that in place as of now because they haven't, had that moment of the nation states coming at me. And I certainly wouldn't advocate for any company going from 0 to 100 in that area and, diverting resources to a robust intelligence center. But there are certainly things that companies can and should be doing just to baseline the information out there and to determine if they are a threat, and then to augment that or support that. We certainly need a more robust national and global framework for how we deal with these issues that harnesses various constituencies to help the companies and the end users.
Yeah.
Todd, if I could jump in.
Please, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to stress that even though we've been talking about foreign threat actors, this is very much alive and well here domestically. And I will talk a little bit about my time in the FBI before I retired and came to the private sector. I spent the majority of my career doing undercover work. And I recall one case that I worked. It was an anti-government case, a sovereign citizen group that I spent 3 years infiltrating in order to gather the evidence of their illegal criminal activity. And at the end of the day, they wrapped all this ideology around the fact that they were in it for the money. There was a fiduciary gain. They would handpick sections of U.S. federal law, Uniform Commercial Code, maritime law, state laws, and they would piece together a narrative that, when they laid it out, made a lot of sense. But when you go back and you look at the origins of each one of those pieces of evidence that they provided, they had nothing to do with the context in which they were putting it. And then they used that narrative to convince people that the United States government was not a government at all. It was, in fact, a private U.S. corporation. And that if you could go through their process and monetize your birth certificate, you could use those funds to eliminate your tax bills, your mortgage, pay off your cars. Well, the result was people ended up getting prosecuted and going to jail for this. Well, at the end of the day, the leaders of this misinformation that were propagating this across the United States, they knew it wasn't accurate, but they'd become so accustomed to the amount of money they were making on it that they continue to do it. So there are some very ideological international threat actors that are targeting American corporations, and there are individuals who are just making a buck out there off it. So that's where I said it's really important you use intelligence tools and people that understand how to get the veracity of this information. And because, as I said, when they explain it to you, it can seem very legitimate.
Yeah. I was going to ask you a little bit different question, but I think on that note, JD, one of the things we talked about early on was trying to understand motivations and figure out the motivations of some of these actors as they're propagating, distributing, and creating misinformation and disinformation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. When we're looking at particularly folks that were either influenced by or copying in operational practice this original Russian information confrontation or active measures doctrine. We're seeing a variety of these strategic objectives coming to the forefront. Either they're seeking to shape decision-making and action by targets of influence in the interest of these planners, in the interest of the mission that they're supporting, or if they're not seeking to shape a specific decision outcome, they're perhaps undermining the legitimacy of political power and the international authority of the targeted country. They may be seeking to destabilize the situation in the country, to use the Russian term, provoking political protest, exacerbating societal conflict. They may be provoking the emergence and development of other negative social phenomena, seeking to reduce the resilience of the country. Russian doctrine also speaks extensively about targeting the morale and the psychological state of the population, which is something we tend not to think about in the West. We consider our population a rather diverse and resilient lot, but the adversary is seeking sometimes simply to cause us pain in that population. We also see some very specific things targeting the identity of national values and the foundations of those values.
Yeah. Melissa, can you talk a little bit more about the profit motive as you think about some of the experiences you've had working with customers and people attacking those customers? How does that profit motive start to play?
I think it really starts to play out, and I really think that it's dominating the cases that we see. The cases that JD is talking about. I think it's more of a undercurrent that's occurring across the various domains. But for us, one of the things that we did 5 or so years ago was we started to see misinformation coming into our practice. As I mentioned, we had folks like a high-profile lawyer coming in and saying, "What's happening here? I can't believe that, I'm being defamed in this way." And our CEO, Teresa Payton, wrote a book on the topic, and as part of her research met with a hacker that was basically hired by a conservative group to monetize essentially kind of news. So he set up a whole operation and communities and nodes of people that were perpetuating information, serving information up to various stakeholders and demographics. So, a lot of people like in the morning to have the soft and easy news, and then they like the conspiracy theories in the afternoon. And then at night, they might navigate to the dark web and 4chan. So he was customizing information and sending it to legitimate people, but then also kind of communities of trolls that would click on the information and they would make a buck off it. So not only was this campaign serving the purpose of perpetuating really kind of right-leaning propaganda, but then also monetizing that and, kind of lining the pockets of the people that were running the campaign.
It's one of the interesting elements of the way we've built out our systems and networks, kind of social media and online media, that you can monetize a lot of things by selling ads if you can get people to click to content. And it's really whatever the content is that creates clicks, those clicks generate ads and generate ad revenue for people.
Exactly.
So the other piece that I've seen in my experience is that there's an international competition element for companies. I may be selling a product globally that faces competition in a particular part of the world, and my competitors may be more local and taking advantage of local media, local opportunities to disparage my product just in a particular market, maybe someplace in the Far East, maybe someplace in Africa. That feels like an opportunity to really expand my intelligence to try and see not just what's going on in news or in the traditional dark web, but really looking at and looking for discussions of my products, my company in all kinds of media, especially social media.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point. And, essentially it comes down to, kind of reading sentiment across the globe and doing it at a larger scale. So the downside of that can be just the pure cost of, ingesting data and analyzing the information. So it takes, in my opinion, partially, having the right tool sets, but then also having the right investigators and the right team in place that can help to identify where the true misinformation is occurring versus a couple of people that were dissatisfied with a product.
Yeah.
Well, I think Melissa brings up a really valid point that you have to have those components in place. I would also add on that you need to be able to package that information and give it to decision makers, senior leadership in the company, so that they can read it in a way that they understand what it is, and then have that relationship with your corporate communications so that they can then craft messaging, right? We as security professionals are probably not going to be the ones and shouldn't be the ones to craft that messaging. But by giving the intelligence, we give decision makers then the information that they need to make an informed decision.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Mark, because sentiment analysis, it feels like much more like a marketing kind of function and job thing. So it feels like integrating between your intelligence team, your marketing team, your communications team. It feels like you need some fusion here.
Well, this is where if you're thinking about how do I avoid this in the future, maybe I haven't been subject to a misinformation campaign yet. How do I prepare in my company in that eventuality? Well, these are the conversations you should start having now, and engaging in these conversations with your marketing staff, with your corporate communications, and saying, how are we going to combat this? Are we going to have monthly meetings? Do we have biweekly meetings? You meet under blue sky conditions and you run through some scenarios. You can even tabletop those type of discussions. But the first time you start talking about it ought not when you're subject to a misinformation campaign.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's critical that you plan ahead and that you think about it. For any of you, is it easy to make a campaign worse if somebody's targeting your products or your company? Are there things you should never do?
I'll take that one and expound maybe a little bit upon what Mark just said. I have another example from our practice. We worked over during the COVID. We're still in the middle of COVID, but during the worst times of COVID, with a large health organization that was very forward-leaning about its response to determining how to roll out the vaccine. It's a very rural community, and in probably last summer was looking at where can we vaccinate people? How can we do it for free before the vaccine even occurred? And some of the people in the anti-vaccination community caught wind of it and started, essentially going online and giving the hospital organization bad reviews, again, disparaging and kind of issuing fraudulent things around the executives. And, when we kind of stepped in there, it is a question of, you don't want to give the people orchestrating this more gasoline. You don't want to incite them even more. So, we kind of initiated a campaign of just a very kind of quiet de-escalation of the situation without necessarily, calling into the public domain that this was happening, but just kind of issuing some takedowns, repairing reputations, and doing it quietly. That, of course, creates a tension where many folks in the community would say, we need to shine a light on what's you can't let people just kind of live in the shadows. But for some of the organizations that are dealing with this at the outset of this becoming a major issue in the private sector, it's kind of, in my opinion, the best course of action. And you certainly need that fusion approach where it's not just the chief security officer and the chief information security officer trying to figure out what to do, but there's close collaboration with communications, legal, and any other stakeholders in the organization that should have a seat at the table.
I think that kind of brings us back around to that discussion of what are some of the levers. JD, were you going to comment on that last question?
Oh, I was actually just going to agree. I would also add that one of the key early intelligence needs is understanding the actual reach of a malign influence campaign. Adversaries are often far more ambitious than they can execute. In a number of cases, the messaging we see will quickly fade as they fail to gain traction. They will double down on bets where they can actually achieve something, and they'll circle back around to targets that have proven vulnerable to the messaging. Unfortunately, Western media can often provide very substantial boosting to what would otherwise be a limited campaign. And a major corporate response that's very open and very heavily engaged may well be the hook that makes what is otherwise a fringe conspiracy theory newsworthy for a mainstream publication. So unfortunately, the story often becomes about the company's response as much as the problem itself.
That's why I do come back to thinking that planning your responses and thinking about kind of the levers that you can play with early really becomes important. Mark, can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that you think about as levers that you can use to push back on or to counter a misinformation campaign?
Yeah, Todd, good question. As a security department, again, we follow our motto, which is protecting our people, our assets, and our ability to power our communities. So when there's this disinformation that's out there, this, as Melissa was saying, she's spot on that this is a collaborative team that you need to engage with, which includes legal and corporate communications and all these things. Now, the levers I have to pull when there's misinformation, I'm not so much concerned about how we're going to respond to it because we've got really, really smart people that are going to do that. I'm concerned with how do I protect our assets? Because if this misinformation campaign is out there and somebody acts on it, then I have to do something about it, whether it's true or not, right? It's helpful to let our leadership know if it's true or not. But I'll give you a recent example. We all know what happened with the insurrection and the whole narrative around the fact the election being stolen, and there was this misinformation that if they could stop the certification of the Electoral College, then it would stop the peaceful turnover of power. Well, as a result of that, the social media companies somehow were included, being culpable, and now there were calls for physical attacks on the social media companies, on their data centers. Well, we have several of these data centers in our area of responsibility, and we supply a great deal of electricity and energy to them. So now the brunt of the attack is not only against the social media companies, but they're against our assets. So what does that mean for me? What levers do I pull? Well, I have to increase security patrols, whether there be airborne or ground patrol. I have to bring in additional surveillance assets, cancel vacations for my employees, bring in additional staff into our SOC to monitor, coordinate with across sectors with these companies' security directors to ensure that we have a unified security response. So there's a lot of levers that get pulled that I have to pull as a result of the misinformation that's coming in while we're attempting to validate the truthfulness and the accuracy behind the misinformation.
Yeah. It sometimes feels like everything is misinformation now, that people are constantly trying to twist things. How do you think about trying to figure out kind of whether someone's purposefully trying to twist things or whether it's really just a matter of different perspectives?
I think it's really difficult. I was taught that dissent is the cornerstone of democracy, and you're really getting into some gray areas by potentially curbing free speech or taking away the ability of people to dissent or to have an opposing opinion to the popular opinion. So again, it's you get into the topic of needing kind of a top-down principled approach to how the nation and how the world will manage this issue moving forward. And how do you do that with preserving things like free speech and the ability to dissent is something that I think really needs to be unpacked by a variety of people in different positions.
Yeah. As we think about identifying these campaigns, identifying activity, are there some particular ways that we should approach or think about talking to executives? Is there something we need to do to plan specific ways to highlight misinformation and disinformation campaigns to executives?
Yeah, I think when it comes to executives, the most effective approaches are showing, not telling. So, starting to look across what's kind of in front of your corporation and baselining the information, collecting the information and determining, is there an issue? Looking at competitors or looking at other organizations in your industry to see, are they facing this issue yet? If they're not facing the issue, I personally would advocate for, if you have a memo that goes up to the CEO quarterly or up to the board quarterly, spend a couple of sentences saying, I baseline this, I looked at it, and we're good to go for now. Here are the things that I'll be looking out for, and I'll update you. If unfortunately you find something that's problematic, then that's where, as Mark and I have been kind of talking about, you move forward with that collaborative approach and kind of work horizontally across the organization to further define the problem, the threat, the risk, and elevate that up to the C-suite. But I do think it's very important right now at this stage to just start a dialogue and start, kind of thinking about what is your company as it's situated need to defend and protect itself.
Yeah. JD, when I think about other kinds of attacks, if I think about ransomware, if I think about typical financial attacks on my financials, typical kinds of attacks, a lot of organizations kind of know when you call the FBI, when you call the Secret Service, when you call local police. Where do you go in the government? Where do you go for misinformation and for help with misinformation from a public-private partnership perspective?
Challenging question. The U.S. government is necessarily well postured to address these questions. When there are specific threats, when there are specific economic impacts, there are various law enforcement mechanisms that can be brought to bear. If it's an overseas diplomatic issue or foreign intelligence issue, the State Department has a global engagement center. They have the Overseas Security Advisory Council to have those conversations with a variety of entities to think about that problem. But increasingly, that's not something that the US government is even necessarily in the mix of addressing. There are certain foreign governments that are attempting to become more substantially involved in their information environments. We can look to the information hygiene efforts of the Nordic countries, for example, that are looking for these very strong civic engagement under their model of government. We've seen some efforts in the European Union to address this, but there's not as much a role. Now, of course, when you see some certainly particularly egregious actions, I'll call out the Iranian-backed disinformation and propaganda campaigns targeting specific voters, specific election messaging themes and election infrastructure software vendors during the 2020 federal elections, where they impersonated a domestic extremist group to threaten officials and voters. That was very clearly a law enforcement response. That was very clearly a government action that happened with stunning speed, incredible in the history of attribution. But oftentimes, when you're dealing with these problems as a corporate organization, you're not in the first hours going to have strong attribution. Attribution does matter. Attribution will matter to your C-suite and it will matter to your board, even if it doesn't matter in the immediate response to the first crisis communications message, the first set of calls you're going to have to make. It will shape the scope of your response in weeks to months to come, particularly as adversaries will revisit targets that are perceived to be vulnerable. But that's something that is only developed, unfortunately, over some time. Attribution is a hypothesis that you build observables from evidence over that period of time. In many cases, you're going to have to be working from playbooks of prior planning that anticipates areas in which your company may be entangled in a series of issues. And it's those early conversations around the government affairs groups or with the government affairs group around those entangled issues that I think will provide the natural point of contact in government to help you find who is the partner to be across that table when something comes to the fire.
Yeah.
Todd, I will tell you, 5 years ago, the FBI initiated a program called the Private Sector Coordinator Program. And that was a job that mandated every FBI field office have one person designated to be the official liaison between the Bureau and companies within their AOR. That is an excellent place to start. You can pick up the phone, call your local FBI field office and say, hey, I need to speak to the private sector coordinator. Most of us that work for Fortune 500 companies already have a relationship with that person, with that agent. But if you don't, you can pick up the phone and call them. And that is a great single point of contact to start.
No, that's great advice. I think, believe it or not, we've run through our time here pretty much completely. So let me give each of you a chance for a last thought for the audience, things that they should be thinking about to prepare for the future in this space. Melissa, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a great panel, and I've learned from both JD and Mark along the way. So I've taken some notes here. I think it's important to be pragmatic and think about how your company's situated, how you're personally situated, and think about incremental successes. This can appear to be a very, very difficult and hard problem to solve. And frankly, there are areas that are not solvable at this point in time. Because again, we need more of a kind of united problem-solving view on this. So be pragmatic and incremental in your approach.
Thank you. JD, last words?
I've enjoyed the conversation quite a bit. I'll simply note for a lot of folks, this is something that they're not experiencing as much today. But as we see it expand among a variety of adversaries, it's something that will come to the table. So perhaps it is a matter for futures analytic tradecraft, because the developments you're going to have to react to aren't necessarily the things we've been talking about, the examples we've been giving. And they're going to challenge us with their variety and frankly, sometimes the absurdity as they intermix across modern popular culture. And having those conversations early with the business unit, with the C-suite, with your government counterparts, will probably surface some things that will serve you in good stead down the road.
Thank you. Mark, last words.
Lastly, I'll just echo what JD and Melissa said is it's about collaboration within your company, within the different components of your company, with the Bureau and other intelligence community partners, and within your industry because this problem isn't getting any better. It's only going to get worse as there's more and more misinformation out there. As they get better at deep fakes, it's going to become a bigger and bigger problem. You fight that with knowing what the facts are and having those relationships beforehand.
Now, let me just wrap up by saying I think we've seen this continuing trend of things starting with people that have a lot of money, and that very rapidly moves down to people who can copy their techniques at scale on the cheap. We've seen that with the way cloud services have let the bad guys, various kinds of adversaries, scale their activities. And I think we'll see that they learn very quickly how to scale and use misinformation and disinformation, particularly in for-profit ways. So stay safe out there. Keep an eye on all the things that are happening around your company, your products, and your services. There's certainly going to be more to come. Thank you all very much for your time today. Thank you for sharing your experiences with our audience, and thank you to the audience for sticking with us through the conversation.